right. Thank you guys for joining and being willing to listen. This is a topic I love to get into. Just as we're starting, this is my first time doing this via Zoom, so just as we're doing this, you can change your view on your screen in kind of the upper right. Because I'll be sharing my screen at points, depending on how many speakers you want to be looking at one time or people. That is a good handy thing to have. And if anyone is looking at this on their phone, when I share my screen, it might start very zoomed in and you've got to use your fingers to zoom it back out. But with that, I'll start diving in. So everyone got that on their screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. As we get in, I do want this to be advantageous to everyone. This was originally kind of a way to communicate the Ryan Neal podcast dealing with the same topics, and that's kind of where we jumped off from. So this will start with some of the bonsai soil basics, and then we'll dive in deep into different topics. There's probably, there's 100 different rabbit trails we could go down. So if there is a question that's related, feel free to ask it. The more questions, the better in my mind. So that screen you're looking at, Bonsai Soils and Micromanaging Microbiota, that if you're new to bonsai, that granular stuff behind the lettering there is fairly typical bonsai soil. We use very granular soils, and we'll get into why that's the case as we dive in here. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so ultimately we want to try and recreate is nature's ideal soil composition. And that's where a lot of people say, well, what is nature's ideal soil composition? If you look, there's a chart on your screen. This is the ideal makeup in nature. Roughly 25% air, 25% water, 45% mineral, and 5% organic matter. So only half of your soil is being inhabited by air and water, and then it's only a quarter each. And that squiggly line in the middle there is kind of indicating when you water, obviously the water percentage will be higher. As it dries down, the air percentage will be higher. That's kind of your goal if we're mimicking nature. And that 45% mineral, that's in nature is going to be your sand, silt, and clay. We're mimicking that through pumice, scoria, turfus, akadama, all of the rock-like components that we use in bonsai soil. And we're trying to use components that have a high porosity, high ability to hold on to nutrients. We need to maximize the surface area in that container because it is so small. And then 5% organic matter, that's something that has kind of come in and out of fashion in bonsai soils. The most common, well, I guess I should put it to everyone, does anyone have any ideas what the organic matter in soil would be made up of? No guesses?
Well, back in Chicago, we used things like oak leaf mold and peat and sphagnum, ground up fine, just to hold the water,
Yep. So that's perfect. So the oak leaf mold, so that'd be some compost basically. And then the sphagnum moss, that's typically kind of a top dress to keep the top of your containers a little more saturated so they don't dry down as quickly. Those are great examples. See if it comes in there. Both of those are on there. Organic fertilizer is another form of organic matter. That's kind of a quick release. You put that on and that the soil microbiota do need to break it down so it can become available to the plants, but it doesn't take long. It's 1 or 2 steps away from being a nutrient to the plant. And then your bark is one that seems to come into fashion and out of fashion with people using it in their bonsai soils. I've started with using it, moved away from it, and I've actually moved back to it since producing this. And in the past couple of years, I've actually had very good results. We'll dive more into some of those results as we keep going. Now, when you get to your water, typically that's just water, right? Now in Colorado, a lot of us are on aquifers and so forth, and so are on very hard water. So if there's an issue there, it's just that you may have water quality concerns. You should be able to get some of that information from your municipality, but you can also do testing as well. I basically toured the Front Range as I completed my college education and used all the different, all the different waters that are available along the Front Range. It did increase my repotting frequency just because the soil would become loaded with lime more quickly, but that was the only difference I had. So then air in the soil, kind of something that a lot of people, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. A question about the water.
Yes.
With it being very hard, and I'm on well water, is there a way to soften it without using salt?
There are. I'll tell you the way I use is reverse osmosis water. That strips the water down to pure, and then you actually have to put things back in, or you'll damage your plants and everything else.
So how do you accomplish that?
There are filters you can buy.
Oh,
so
okay.
Culligan you can call them and they can spec out the type of system you need and they can install it, but you can also find them online, and they're typically fairly easy to put in. Now, I will say something to know going in is that the best ones are a 1-to-1 ratio. For each gallon of water you produce that's pure, a gallon of water goes down the drain to help make it. So you are using a lot more water when you do that. If it's just for your bonsai tree, not a big deal.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
So real quick, I had a question on that because I actually have a reverse osmosis set up at my house. But you were saying that you actually have to put stuff back into the water, minerals. How do you, I guess, go about that, or what do you use to treat the water to bring it back to a satisfactory level for the trees?
Certainly. So you're basically, if you have a total dissolved solids meter, TDS meter, you can get one for, I think, $20 on Amazon.
Yeah.
You want that to be at least around 200. Otherwise, the water will actually strip nutrients away from your plants. Because water can actually be fairly caustic when it's pure. So the things that I use, the typical buffer is called CalMag. So it's calcium, magnesium, and then it'll have nitrogen with it too. I use one that's from Roots Organic. It's calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, because I actually like to really watch the amount of nitrogen that I'm adding to my system. But that's the basics. If you're doing it right, you're using some plant nutrients that the plant needs already to buffer that water. And calcium and magnesium are the easy ones. One last very simple way to do it is get that TDS meter, fill your container with one quarter tap water and the rest with your RO water, and see if that gets your TDS to the level about 200, and that's a real easy way to do it too.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's definitely a good idea for sure. Because I'd actually noticed, because I've got like some indoor tropicals, and we got the reverse osmosis water set up about a year ago. Okay. And this year compared to last year, the trees don't seem to be doing as well. I mean, they're still, healthy, but they definitely don't seem to be reacting the same to the water.
Yeah, every time you water, it's probably a bit of a stress as everything tries to equalize again. So that'll help a lot.
Okay, I'll give it a shot. Thanks.
Yeah, happy to help. And that's perfect. Perfect questions to bring up.
Hey, Paul?
Yes.
Can I say a quick word, which is, for the same reason human beings should not be drinking distilled water, because it will leach minerals from you.
Yep, absolutely correct. Yep.
One other item, Paul. Sorry, City of Denver is now raising the pH level of the city water because they don't want to disturb the lead that's in the service lines to the houses. So people should be aware that pH is pretty high And you might, depending on your trees, you want to lower the pH down to a more acidic level.
I haven't heard, do you by chance know how they're raising the pH?
I think it's up to, I think they said close to 9 at this point. I don't know how. Oh, your question is how? No, I don't know how they're doing it. I probably read it, but I forgot. But the level is significantly above neutral.
Okay.
Why are they doing that?
It's to prevent lead from leaching into the system. They're to protecting the people. An easy way to bring that back down is acetic acid, which is vinegar. Get some distilled white vinegar, and if I remember right, it was 1 or 2 milliliters per gallon for me would typically balance the pH out. All right, that last bullet point, back on topic, guys. Airfield pores. So a lot of people don't think about air in soil. A lot of people think you water and you want as much water as that thing will hold, specifically with bonsai because the container is so small. But roots do need air, with very few exceptions. They do need air. So it's better to think of your roots hanging out in a sauna in the soil, slowly sipping water off of the granules in your soil and just enjoying their nice warm root sauna. We'll get into our next slide. Keep diving in. All right, so perched water tables. Does anyone here have familiarity with perched water tables? It's very critical to bonsai culture, but a topic that not a lot of people often understand.
Okay. I do. I mean, I know what it's about, so.
Okay. So some people know a little bit about what it's about. If you look at the image on the bottom, that's an illustration of different size containers, but no matter the size of the container, and these are, in this example, filled with nursery soil, that perched water table is going to be at that same level in every container. So by the time you get to that small container, it's solid water. And really, you should be thinking of a bonsai container in that reference. If you were using nursery soil in that situation, it's probably not nearly enough air in that pocket of soil. Now, I am going to see if I can find my cursor here. Switch to my camera, and if you guys have the multi-person view, you might switch to just me. And again, that should be in the upper right. While you're doing that, I'm going to rotate. I've got a little experiment set up to illustrate perched water tables. All right. As you can see, we've got a dish. Whoop. A lot of blue water in it. Do this right. I've got a giant sponge here. It's pretty much going to soak up all of this water. Think of this sponge as nursery potting mix, what's typically used. If you look at your typical sponge, the hole sizes are all random shapes, but fairly fine in size. And if you think of a saturated sponge, it holds a lot of water, actually similar to nursery soil. So I'll try and hold that up here. It's pretty well soaked up. All of the water in that dish is in the sponge. As gently as I can, I'm going to get this on top here. And think of this now as you're trying to drain your bonsai pot. Might not show up the best, but there's no water draining. You can see on the sponge, it's still full of water. So this would be what your soil would be like if you're using nursery soil in a bonsai container. Flat, squat container, just like a bonsai container. Now, if we take this same volume, but we're going to change the orientation of the shape to mimic more of a nursery container that would be a little bit taller, suddenly the water starts draining like crazy. And you can see your perched water table. It's leaving you 1.5, 2 inches there at the bottom that's fully saturated. And there's one more turn, again, going up tall, and it's again going to drain down to that same size. Kind of a fun illustration. But the whole point being, when you're in that bonsai container configuration, it holds too much water. Get my setup back here. Thanks for bearing with me. Okay, get back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so as we already talked, as you kind of saw in the demonstration there, the perched water table is going to be in any container. The only thing that changes it is the depth of that container will allow it to drain because of gravitational force. When you hit that bottom, that's the forces of water able to hold on to itself. The soil particles in the container are stronger than gravity, and it just sits. Now there's the size and shape have no effect on the depth of that perched water table. The only thing that will change that is the size of the particle or soil particle that you're using. So by sifting the fines out of our soils, the goal is to use soils that are 1/4 to 1/8 inch in size. You pretty well eliminate that perched water table. But you're using, those granules are made of porous material, which continue to hold on to enough water to get to your next watering. So that bottom bullet point, that is why it's absolutely critical you remove all the fines from your soil. If you're doing bonsai, to have healthy root growth, they need that to remove that perched water table so they have the right balance of air and water. Before I go on, is that making sense to people? Did that help? Is there anything else I can help answer? Okay, we'll keep going.
So, Paul, there was a question in the chat.
Okay.
I think Connie wanted to know, is that only for nursery soil that it's problematic, or is that for, assuming, is that for all types of soils?
Really, that's for all types of soils. It's the bonsai soil and maybe some hydroponics are the only ones that have, to my knowledge, eliminated the fines, which greatly reduces the perched water table. You still have one, but I'm guessing it's like 1/4 to 1/2 inch instead of your full container. So any soil that does contain fines, that is a concern. Now that's to say, you can grow bonsai in glass marbles or in, seedling fines. What changes is your ability to manage it. If you're growing in a very fine nursery soil, you can be done, but you have to be very careful with how much water you add, and it just changes the dynamic. By changing your soil particle size to that 1/8 to 1/4 inch, it's nearly impossible to overwater your trees. So you don't have to worry about, am I watering too much? And you just create that nice, happy root zone that you're able to maintain, and it just gives you a healthier, more vibrant tree much more easily. So already talked about it, eliminates that perched water table. We kind of mentioned the hydroponics. So bonsai, as I've gone through schooling, I've kind of grasped the idea that it's really hybridized version between aeroponics and hydroponics. Aeroponics is when the roots are suspended in air and misted with nutrients frequently. Hydroponics is when the roots are submerged in water at all times. We're kind of in the middle of that. We're not in a soil, we're in a substrate that's made of porous gravel, basically, and we water to try and keep an even moist condition there. And again, that's that root sauna we talked about, where the roots are just in that nice 100% humidity, and they can grab a sip of water off the closest bonsai soil particle at any time. So by using highly porous materials, you're maximizing the given surface area in the container, because again, for bonsai design, our containers are small in nature. So it's to our benefit to maximize everything we can in that container so that our care and maintenance is much easier. I guess using that same example, if you were to try and grow bonsai in glass marbles, you'd have to water every 5 minutes. If you can take that on, go for it. But it's better to set up a situation that we can maintain that the tree is also happy in. And the last point would be that we want to maximize cation exchange capacity within the small container. So that's slightly different than porosity. That has to do with the charge on the soil component itself. With a negative charge, will attract positively charged ions, which is what most fertilizer components are, other than a few forms of nitrogen. So the soil, your field soils naturally have that very high. Container soils, this is kind of a slightly newer concept. The way it's measured is somewhat debated, but the end result is the higher the cation exchange capacity, probably the better off you are at being able to buffer the soil and hold on to nutrients so that your fertilizer doesn't just wash through. The soil can hold on to it and then release it to the roots as needed. Get to our next slide here. Okay, so the new concept. Can we take all that and then turn it into a highly functioning organic ecosystem? That's kind of the question that was posed by Ryan Neal and Ian. Forgive me, I'm not recalling his last name, but he's one of Dr. Elaine Ingham's students that specializes in highly organic soils, making the soil microbiota work for the plants. It's a challenge in our small spaces. It is a challenge, but the route to doing that will be coming up on the next slides. So the reason you'd want to incorporate organics into your soils is the soil microbiota, often can create symbiotic relationships. Those symbiotic relationships will help take care of your tree. So fungal relationships are most common and are fairly well known in bonsai to happen with pine trees and a lot of conifers. That's often spoken about as to why you always want to keep some of that old soil, transfer it to the new container so that you're inoculating the new container with that the fungal spores from your previous repot. If you have that symbiotic relationship, what it does is increase the rooting area by up to 50 times. So if you take that small bonsai container, multiply it by 50, that's quite a nice big area that the tree would be able to take advantage of. The way it does this is that the fungal hyphae, that's the white fungal threads, are much finer than roots. They can actually gain access to micropores within the soil that the roots do not have access to. And with our soils and in bonsai containers, I'm sure that's different than a field soil, but it's still going to be increasing the tree's abilities within the same container. The next thing that happens with these symbiotic relationships, specifically with fungi, but it does pertain with bacteria as well, they occupy infection points on the root. So really these symbiotic relationships are infecting the root. It's just doing good things. So if you think of my arm, if you can see it on the camera here, in fact, I'll stop sharing here. If you can think of my arm as a cell, and right where that bump in the elbow is where a fungal associationship could happen. If it's the beneficial mycorrhizal fungi, it's occupied it. So when a pathogen enters, there's not a spot for it to occupy, and it acts like hired security for your roots. Very beneficial in that you're now not just helping feed your tree, but you're preventing it from getting disease and sickness at the same time. So these symbiotic relationships have evolved over the millennia with plants, and they're very specific most often to the species of plant itself. So your ponderosa pine is going to have potentially a symbiotic relationship with a specific type of fungus, whereas your corn growing on the farm is a very different symbiotic relationship with a different fungus. There are a lot of broad spectrum. I'll say in general, if you have the original field soil, keep some of it, because as I've researched this, most likely these associations have developed with the fungi feeding near the roots of that tree off of the material coming off that tree. It's its own little ecosystem. That's how these relationships have evolved, but you can get broad spectrum, and I recommend like the tree and shrub mycorrhizal fungi you can get at the nurseries because it is the proper type for woody plant material. So already kind of getting into that ecosystem, they work in parallel. This would be the advantage. This is where they're the micro managers of your soil. It's often talked about, don't fertilize your trees in the spring, let them flush out. That'll help reduce needle length. And we have all these timings set up. Well, these symbiotic relationships that have evolved happen in at the same timing as the trees. So as the soil warms up and the microbiota become more active, they start creating the nutrients that the tree might want. At the same time, the sun's starting to get the sunshine and desiring those nutrients. And so they work in unison. The advantage there is you can have a low level organic nutrient in your soil that it's only going to become active to the plant when the microbiota start functioning again in unison with the tree itself. So you're encouraging this mini or ecosystem that's evolved over millennia to help manage the tree for you as it would in nature. The last thing that would happen, I think this is particularly useful for anyone who uses akadama in their bonsai soils. The fungal communities will continue to add fungal hyphae, which fluff the soils. And then bacteria will add organic glues, which help build what are called soil colloids. If anyone's ever worked with like a black crumble soil, it's kind of your most desirable garden soil. You can dig a big chunk out of it, and as you crumble it, the crumbles it crumbles into are the exact same size as our bonsai soils, about that 1/4 to 1/8 inch size. So we're unintentionally kind of mimicking nature with our bonsai soils with that very good soil structure that's naturally creating these little soil colloids that allows for proper drainage and water retention. So the reason that's important with akadama is akadama does break down over time. It's highly debated as to how quickly that happens in our climate. I'll say I've not personally had a lot of luck with it, but if you are using it, by encouraging these organic symbiotic relationships, you should be able to maintain a good structure within your pot, even as your akadama breaks down. Any other questions on that? It's a lot coming at you guys. If I can explain any further, let me know. All right, we'll continue.
I actually do have a question, Paul.
Go for it.
So are these, does this work if you're not using organic fertilizers?
So the microbiota, at least initially, will still be there.
Yeah.
But the synthetic fertilizers, you know what, that might even be on my next slide. Not quite.
I mean, we can shelf it too, but it was just, I jotting down questions I have as we go.
Yeah, you know what, I am going to get to that. To keep it simple for now, the thing I'll say is your synthetic fertilizers are immediately ready for the plant. So it's doing nothing to encourage the relationship because the plant can go straight to what it needs. That's been seen to has a depressing effect to the life within the soil. But my experience has been switching back to organic. It doesn't take long for those things to start firing off again on their own.
Nice. Cool. Thanks.
Is the synthetic fertilizer the same as inorganic?
Correct. So the if you're looking at a fertilizer, if there's always going to be 3 numbers listed, actually that's perfect. Does the cursor show up on your guys' screen?
Yeah, we see it, or at
Okay.
least I see it.
So down here, it shows BioGold NPK equals 5.5 to 6 to 3. Every fertilizer package should have an NPK and those 3 numbers listed. What that is your nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. It's telling you how much of each. If those numbers are under 10, chances are you're looking at an organic soil. If they're above 10, chances are it's a synthetic fertilizer. That's a pretty easy way to tell the difference between the two. And I've used both. You can absolutely go either way. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve. In this case, we're kind of getting into trying to get the symbiotic relationships through an organic regimen to help care for the trees for you. So, a perfect kind of segue there of how to feed the soil for vitality. Like this is, so now we're not just thinking about trees, we're thinking about the little microorganisms in the soil that are helping feed the trees for us. If you're to build a compost, they have what's called a C to N ratio of 30:1. That's carbon to nitrogen for just a basic compost pile. The C stands for carbon, the N is for nitrogen. In nature, your carbon is going to be your branches, your woody material. Your nitrogen is any green leafy material. So 30 parts wood to 1 part green leafy material, that's a good compost pile going for you. The more carbon you add, the more fungal relationships you're encouraging, the more nitrogen, the more bacterial. For bonsai, typically we're going for fungal relationships. The one exception might be some of the rainforest trees do live in a very bacterial dominant soil. I don't think that would be super critical, but if you're really tweaking with things, you could dive into some of that and change your fertilizer regimes, as well as if you're adding compost. So the form of nitrogen, I think that's probably a little deeper than what we need to get into. I'll briefly talk on it. The two basic forms that your plant can uptake is nitrate and ammonium. Nitrate is, for bonsai, probably considered a slightly better form. It's taken up by the plant, but then has to be turned into ammonium before it's used. So it does require a little bit of energy to use, giving us a little more controlled, slower growth. Ammonium, on the other hand, is a little bit of the junk food of nitrogen. It's easily absorbed and it can be used immediately. Ironically, it's preferred by conifers with an ectomycorrhizal relationship. So that ectomycorrhizal is the mycorrhiza that's good for trees and shrubs. And I should mention, like, I will make this PowerPoint available through the Bonsai Society. So anyone who's scribbling furiously at everything, I can get this out to everyone so you have the notes. But that's a little deeper than needed. It's one of those fungi infect inside the root. One of them is the infection is on the outside of the root, being the ecto. So here's our synthetic versus organic. The real difference is your synthetic is mineralized already. It's in that basic form, ready for the roots to use. The organic, they're slightly more complex compounds that the soil microbiotic life will come in and break apart, that then can be used as fertilizer by the plant. And that's kind of that ecosystem you're trying to drive. With synthetic, the thing I would say, if you are going the synthetic route, just make sure it's a balanced fertilizer that includes your micronutrients. And I like to keep those numbers a little bit low, unless you're in production, just trying to push fast growth. Something that was mentioned in the podcast by Ryan Neal is kelp. Kelp is very high in a plant hormone called cytokinin, which is what's known to increase ramification. That's kind of the fine branching. Now, that is very true. However, I don't know that cytokinin can actually be absorbed by the roots intact. It certainly wouldn't hurt, but I don't know that that's truly going to lead to the more ramified growth. I have been using it, and I can't say that I've seen a difference in my branching so far. When it comes to that, like I guess the other side of that is the stuff I'm using is not cold pressed. That's what's supposed to be the most untouched, basically. So you're not breaking any of the constituent parts down beyond usable. But it is also very high in micronutrients, and it is a great micronutrient feed if you need it. So Ryan Neal and Bonsai Mirai, and actually a lot of bonsai artists in the club, are all big fans of the BioGold. That is a fertilizer from Japan, I believe. it's kind of hard to get all the information on it. It took me some searching to find this ratio. The only other things I could see is that it has calcium, magnesium, natural vitamins, and minerals. If Ryan Neal's using it and it's working, it must be good stuff. He has phenomenal trees. I just can't bring myself to buy a product that I don't know what's in it. I like to geek out on trying to feed my trees exactly what they need. I've used Fox Farms general purpose fertilizer. That's worked great for me in the past. At this point, I've kind of switched to a little more of a hydroponic route. I'm using GrowBiz nutrients. It's a Dutch company. They're a little bit pricey. The reason I'm doing it is trying to find the balance where the bonsai's happy and so is the blanket of moss. So I've got my own little experiment going there. The last thing that they brought up was humic acid and humates. I don't know if Daryl Havener's on tonight, but we were just talking about this yesterday. A great product, really for us, it would be the humates in particular. Humic acid is in a liquid form that's typically used in the garden or on turf. Humates are a granular form, can actually be a soil component. They're going to help balance the pH range in your soil to where all the nutrients are absorbable. And that's a very nice benefit for us in Colorado because they tend to be slightly acidic, whereas our waters tend to be high pH, more basic. So it's going to help fight that hard water and keep your pH in a range that's more acceptable. Before lots of information on this slide. Any questions before I move on?
What do you use or where do you source the humic acid and humates? And it's interesting because when a couple months ago, when Bjorn did his presentation, he mentioned using Grow Power, and I was looking it up this week, and they actually have humic acid in their fertilizer.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
what do you use for a supplementation for those?
A lot of fertilizers now will have it. You can actually find several companies that produce a granular granular humates, or you can look up leonardite. That's usually the mineral it's been mined from. I think AM Leonard has sources for it. Like you can find it anywhere with a simple Google search. A lot of it's powderized. I think it's cheaper to get the granular. You're searching, I think, that 1/4 to 1/8 inch size, and it's ready to go as a soil component. I can't tell you how much. I will say I've used a fair amount, so you don't have to be too cautious, but you don't want to plant it in strictly humates. You're going to have problems at that point.
Cool. Thanks, Paul.
Absolutely.
All right.
Real quick, I had a question as far as the pH level goes for, I guess, the best environment to absorb nutrients. Is there a certain pH, like below 7, above 7, or does it really strictly depend on the type of tree?
So there are some species preferences. In general, pH between 5.5 and 6.5 is where all of your nutrients are absorbable.
Okay.
Things like azaleas are slightly more acidic, but if you went with 6.5, you'd still be, I'm sure, perfect. The other thing I will say is with our soils act as a very good buffer, but with our reduced volume of soil, it's easier for the plant to deal with slightly higher pH. It has mechanisms to reduce it than to bring the pH up. So to err on the side of caution, would say keep your pH just a little bit higher and the plant will do the rest.
Okay, it's probably between like maybe a 6 and a 7 then.
Yeah, I would say that's a perfect target.
Awesome, thanks.
Got it. All right, this slide, I produced this, but from data that came from the Journal of the American Bonsai Society. And when I get to the end of the presentation, I'll point out the reference to the article. You can find it online. Once we can all meet again, I know that the club has this volume as well. But basically, the author took almost every different product we might use in a bonsai soil and tested it for porosity, both air porosity and water-filled porosity. And then the cation exchange I did get from Colin Lewis, a well-known bonsai artist who has good information out there. But hopefully you can see on your screen, some of them are shaded green, some of them are shaded red, trying to give you an idea of where they fall in that range. And then the white is just kind of in the middle. As you're looking, I guess I should go down here. Okay, so your effective porosity is the total air and water filled potential of the pot. So you're falling in that good range. If you remember, the ideal soil is around 50%. So all of these are that plus. So we're starting with a good situation. You get to your air saturated porosity. So that's after it's been filled with water, allowed to drain. At saturation, how much of that space was actually filled with air? So almost right after watering. You want to be in that 25 to 50% range. Well, say 25 to 45% range, which most of them are. I'll say the unscreened Akadama was a little bit worrying to me. Unscreened Turfus is definitely worrying to me. And most of the Akadama I found is already pre-screened. Of course, it breaks down a little bit more in shipping, but that can kind of explain that discrepancy, the 17 to 35% there. So Akadama, if anyone who's new to the society, Akadama, typically use Akadama or Turfus, not both. That's going to be your clay component in the soil. If you drop down to the bottom where it's the cation exchange capacity, they typically have a nice high cation exchange capacity. Although if we go to the pumice, I use my cursor here, screen pumice is the only component that is green across the board. If you had to use only one component, pumice would be the component to use. And a lot of the guys I know collecting trees, that's what they will put their trees in initially, just to get them to recoup. They've got them on basically heat beds and pumice to grow them out and recuperate the root mass. If there's what I will say is a downside to using any one component is it never quite conglomerates into a soil. It tends to break apart really easy. So your tree never quite anchors itself. Next on the list, you've got screened lava. And we'll go through this a little bit quicker. Screened lava, screened pine bark, screened biochar. Most of these green. The screened lava, the cation exchange. So the screened lava has good porosity for water and air. It's just not going to hold on to a lot of nutrients for you. Screened pine bark, conversely, is going to do great. If anything, the water-filled porosity could be a little bit low, but as that starts to break down, that will change drastically. Biochar is wood that's been burned in the absence of oxygen, and you can get it in a granular nature. It's used for aquarium filtration. It's used for a lot of different things. It is an excellent buffer in the soil to help maintain pH. It absorbs and holds on to nutrients very well. It is a great component to use. Last time I did this, one of the people talked about using her used filter material for her aquarium in her soils. Pretty neat idea, because it would already be preloaded with nitrogen from the fish emulsion that it's filtering out of the tank. So you're adding a fertilizer to your soil already. Just don't plant in pure biochar that's loaded up with that, or it'll be a little too much. Depending on where your little icon is, your video might be getting in the way. But he then had several screened mixes, and I really could he had 4 or 5 different kinds of mixes. That's why the range is pretty broad. But the point of this being, once you get a conglomeration of these materials and they're all screened, you end up in the green across the board. You end up with the great total porosity, great air-filled porosity, great water-filled porosity. It's kind of hard to list the cation exchange, but if you're using all these great components, it's going to end up great. The last is your ideal range. So if you wanted to actually test your own components and know what range they should fall in, there's a great indicator for what you want to be. And again, think back to the first slide with the ideal soil composition. It's going to be a 50% air and water, and that's going to break down into approximately 25% each plus. And then, as we talked, the measurements for cation exchange, there's a little bit of debate, but the higher the better. Your field soils are typically around 400, so we're still not getting anywhere close to that. So in my opinion, the higher you can be, the better. Better results you will have there. Any questions on any of these components? I know they're common names to all of us who use this all the time, but for anyone new, any questions on that?
Hey, Paul, this is Daryl. There's sort of been some mythology floating around out there that pine bark steals nitrogen from the soil, but I don't think that's true. And I would at least point to one part of the science, but also when we grow in boxes, there's all sorts of wood around it, and our boxes do great. So.
Yeah, so initially, that's a great point to bring up, Daryl. Initially, it can steal nitrogen and fertilizer components from the soil because initially it's going to be a sponge. But as soon as any soil microbiota start working away at that piece of bark or wood or what have you, the nutrients begin to release again. So it's really about the ratios. If you were to plant in straight uncomposted pine bark, it would suck all the nutrients out of your plant. Once it's been composted, it's already going to be starting to break down. So it's a little more give and take, but it's the uncomposted stuff that's the real concern. And if it's just the sides of your wooden boxes, it's not enough to make a big enough difference. And if anything, what I would say, typically you want to reduce nitrogen after a repot anyways, if not fertilizer. So by having the wood box and or some orchid fir bark in the pot, initially you're preventing from over fertilizing, and eventually that will again start to release and become available to the plant. But I do like to use a little of both. I have a product, it's a mulch that's sold by a tree company in town. It's just their fine shredded mulch that's whatever trees they were cutting up. So it's both the wood and the leaves. So it's a very wood dominant, but there is some of that nitrogen. So it's a very nice high fungal compost, if you will. I do add a little of that to my soils. And I will say I have experienced some deficiencies initially. I hit it with a little extra fertilizer just to get it over that hump, and everything is just fine. Okay. You guys are great. Nice patient group. I love the questions that are coming, and we're getting close here, which is good because I'm getting close on my time anyways. In the podcast with Ryan Neal, they talked about some additional substrate options worth bringing up and mentioning to the group. And this is where I'd really love to start getting into conversation about this. And anything else, any other questions you have. So we've already talked about the granular humates. They're reported, it's kind of across the board, it depends on the source, but some of the cation exchange rates I was finding were 450. And if you recall, that's roughly what your field soils are at. So an excellent thing to have in your containers. I believe Biochar is actually similar in that nature. Diatomaceous Earth is one that I believe that briefly mentioned on the podcast, and somebody last time had brought it up. Diatomaceous earth is used often to get rid of pests in a ground powder state. It acts as, it's basically microscopic razor blades to soft body insects, and it will tear them up. You can get granular forms, can be used as a bonsai soil. It will reduce the vigor of your soil microbiota if you're trying to use this organic approach. Because think of all those tiny microscopic bodies in the soil could be getting shredded to bits by the diatomaceous earth. Now, if you have a a species that's very prone to disease, maybe that'd be a benefit. But worth working with. And I will say, where I work in California, that's what the grapevines are growing in, is basically diatomaceous earth, and they do great. And it does help with pathogen pressure. Another component brought up on the podcast was basalt. Basalt is it's a volcanic rock. It is very high in nutrients. It has been used historically by farmers. It's going to be pricey because obviously it's got to come from a volcanic source, so you're paying to have it shipped and so forth. Ian, the person contributing on the podcast, made mention of it being paramagnetic, something about it being in sync with the Earth's magnetic field. You'd have to show me the science on that one. I can't speak to that, but it could be a fertilizer component, but I don't think it's necessary. Be interested if anyone ever found any to play with, if they got any different results. We already spoke briefly about biochar being the wood burned in the absence of oxygen. It just becomes a very reactive material in your soil. It will hold on to nutrients and release, and it's a great buffer to maintain soil pH. Organic components, bark, compost, fungi. So I'll speak to the bark and compost. As mentioned, that's kind of what I'm already doing. I've had great results. I use chopsticks to kind of measure the moisture in my containers, and I just leave them in there and they slowly break down. But every time I pull those out, I've got little white fungal hyphae attached to the chopstick itself. So I know there's fungal relationships happening in the soil. It's probably too early to say whether I've noticed a difference in are the leaves greener. I won't say that, but I will say it is working very well for me. And where I am using it, it has become much easier to maintain moss with the bonsai, which for me has been a benefit. That's been something I've been trying to figure out for a while. Fungi, I want to mention that because there is actually a thing called mushroom compost, and it's composted mushrooms. It's high in salts. You don't want to use that. So stay away. We do want fungal activity in the soil because of fungi, but you don't want fungal compost. And the last thing, which I had already touched on briefly, is keep in mind, like no single component is going to make for a great substrate. Pumice is the one exception that you could get away with, but by adding other components, one weakness is strengthened by the other constituent, and so on and so forth, and you just create a really nice, basically, lattice for your roots to live and grow on. All right, so the crux of plant and soil co-evolution here is kind of a takeaway from all of this as I was researching it, and some kind of an aha moment for me. So the cellular microbiota, if we're going to achieve this organic relationship, we want to mimic what happens in nature, and specifically in this instance with that plant species and that fungus that we're hoping to take advantage of. So those soil microbiota, they've fed on organic matter shed by the tree and surrounding plant life that's been their existence. They didn't move from a different state. They happen to be there in that relationship. And as that forest and that tree aged and the time continued to go on, they're eating basically that same diet until one day, for whatever reason, one of the fungal spores said, "Hey, what happens if I give this root a phosphorus?" And the tree said, "Oh, that's fantastic. I'm going to give you a sugar." And the symbiosis began. So the plant started trading sugars for primarily phosphorus, but other nutrients as well, and water. And they're both stronger together. So the organic material that's coming off that tree, if it's an oak tree, it's only oak leaves. If it's a pine tree, it's only pine needles. That naturally is going to regulate the type of soil microbiota that exists there, because certain fungi are going to feed on certain things the way trees have their own nutritional requirements. So this in turn is kind of dictating the types and amounts of nutrients that might be fed to the tree because of these symbiotic relationships that have continued to evolve. So that's kind of your full circle. It's like okay, the tree is shedding material, it's decomposing, the fungus is breaking it down, feeding it back to the tree, and we continue this loop and we continue this loop, and together they stand stronger than alone. And it's become a self-managing system. It's theorized that these level of symbiosis don't happen on one level. So it's the root and the fungus. Then who knows, there might be a bacteria and another fungus involved. And so you could have a whole string of events to where the tree can, in a sense, if it has this ability, pick from a menu of what nutrients it needs and build its own nutrition plan. And that is my last slide, but I would love to answer questions, and I want to make sure I get to that one reference here. There we go. Hesley Bryan, Water Retention and Drainage of Bonsai Soils. That is the article that has all of those great soil components tested and laid out. Really, all of these references were great. I really enjoyed putting this together because I know the granular nature, I know the science, I know the perched water tables, I know field soils, but to then take a very inorganic bonsai soil and bring it back to using organics, fun concepts, and so far working out really well for me. So, if nothing else, I thank you guys. I love doing this, but I'd love to answer any questions or go back to slides if there's things you guys want to see.
Great presentation, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you.
I did have a question about the biochar. I was reading Michael Hagedorn's book earlier today, actually, about biochar, and he said that it is inoculated with bacteria and fungi. Do you know anything about that?
I've not found a source that comes with it inoculated, but it's a complex enough structure, it will readily encourage those kinds of relationships. I would say that.
Okay.
Oh, we got a question on the chat. A couple folks were wondering, can you compost the trimmings from your tree to use on your trees, and is it worth it?
How many trees do you have? I would say yes. So that is in here. Let me get his name too. Ian Hunter. He is one of Dr. Elaine Ingham's students. And a big thing, they're into the biodynamic compost. So the more sources of plant material that go into that compost, the more diverse the microbiota in that compost will be. That was their big takeaway. I kind of break that back down and say the stuff that's grown to be symbiotic with ponderosa pines has been eating leftover ponderosa pine for millennia. Doesn't hurt to broaden that range, but yeah, absolutely. If you have trimmings from your tree and you have a compost pile, throw it in, with a few exceptions. Walnuts, trees, which I've only heard of one person trying that. They exude exudates from their roots that inhibit plant growth. That would be something like that would be something to watch out for. But that's the only thing I can think of in Colorado that might be an issue in that regard.
Hey, Paul, this is Daryl again. Since Larry isn't here tonight, I'm going to throw out decomposing granite. I've been using that at about 10% level.
Okay.
For two reasons. One, the mineral component. One, it's heavier than the scoria. It's inert, but it is going to do maybe something similar to the scoria. Can you address that?
Absolutely. I'll say it's predominantly non-porous, although as it's decomposing, you get a little porosity there. The mineral content, I believe it's actually silicate that the conifers definitely like. I'm sure there's some other minerals too, but that's a great point that silicate is a mineral that has not traditionally been in fertilizers, and I think just really in the past 5 years, maybe 10 years, has become more popular. They're still kind of figuring that out, because not every plant, well, every plant uses silicate, but at vastly different levels. Some plants need it to thrive, others use trace amounts. But I have heard a lot of people, Larry included, talk about some decomposing granite in the soil really seemed to help with conifers. So recommended, and I'm not 100%, but I believe it's the silicate.
Oh, Paul, this is Bill. There's also, when you start decomposing granite, the other major mineral component is, of course, of the feldspar groups and the mica groups, and those have a lot of potassium type. They're potassium type minerals that do decompose.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, potassium is one of the macronutrients, so that would be definitely be a good thing to have. Thank you for adding that.
This is Pauline again. Is there a particular fertilizer that is recommended for us here in Colorado?
Man, there's so many. So I will say, like, if you're gonna go the synthetic route, Osmocote Plus is gonna be pretty balanced NPK and heavier micronutrients. If you're going to go the organic route, the Fox Farms General Purpose, really probably any of the Fox Farms organic fertilizers. They even have acid loving ones that would be good for your pine trees and so forth. But in the end, as long as it's a balanced fertilizer and it contains your micronutrients, it should be a good thing to use. And most of them these days are. But if you're at, if you're going to a Lowe's or Home Depot or an Ace Hardware, I'd try and find that Osmocote. I can't think of an organic that I don't think they carry Fox Farms. If you go to a nursery, you can ask them and you can say, I want a well-balanced organic fertilizer to make sure it has micronutrients, and they can absolutely point it out for you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Paul, do you know of anyone who, there are a lot of people that do soil tests, and they'll tell you everything from how much organic you add to whether or not you've got any bad metals as a consequence of stuff. Do you know of anyone that tests bonsai soil? Because usually they want a fine soil, they want it, the big lumps gone and everything else.
The CSU will test potting soils. I've considered trying to send them a bonsai soil sample. My fear is that they're basically like, yeah, we had a petri dish of water and some rock dust in it. Someday when I've got the funds and nothing better to do, I'm sure I'll do it.
Hey, Paul, on that same topic, I've read the same thing, that they sift out the coarse grain material and then test the fine material, which kind of destroys our purpose here.
Right, exactly. You'd almost have to, it'd almost be better to take your fines and ship them that and get a analysis and try and figure you've got some of that going on in your soil. Maybe that's one purpose for the fines. And I guess, yeah, I will say the fines I sift from my soil go on my dry patches of grass, and the stuff that's too large ends up in my vegetable garden soil to keep the porosity up. Well, I hope most of you aren't sleeping, but I had fun with this.
Yeah, this was good.
Awesome.
I just want to add one more thing about so I use this, it's non-organic, it's Dynagrow is the brand, and they sell a Protect, which is they call it the silicon solution. Yep. So when Daryl brought that up, that's what I thought of. I actually bought some, so I'll let you guys know if I notice anything. I don't have it yet, but I have like 4 or 5 Portulacaria afras. And so I was thinking, like, I mean, some of the branches like get kind of out of control and crazy. And so I was wondering, I'm thinking to myself, like, well, maybe that will help the structure, because basically a lot of people use it for, like weed growing, and it helps the structure of those particular plants support the weight of the buds. And so, yeah.
Helps support structure. It also helps with healing in a lot of cases. It makes it unattractive to pests. I guess it's if they get the silicate when they puncture the plant, they don't like it. I do have some of that Dynagrow Protect. It's a potassium silicate, I believe.
Yeah.
It will increase the pH significantly. So just be aware of that. Use it in conjunction with an acidic fertilizer to bring your pH back down.
Nice.
But yeah, Dynagrow makes good products. That is actually Dynagrow Foliage Pro. Was the synthetic fertilizer I used for years with great results.
Yeah, I'm happy with it so far, with the other stuff I have from them. So yeah, cool. And just thanks a lot. Also, I just want to make a comment for everyone else too. Like on everyone else's YouTube videos, they're always like, share, and subscribe. And I think these are really good videos. This one is really timely for me. So thank you, because I was looking into particularly the mycorrhizal components, and then I was realizing like, oh, I probably would need to switch to the organics. So I just think this is really helpful, and I think that would help YouTube promote these videos and circulate them. So
Awesome.
Yeah, but thank you. You did a great job. So thanks a lot, Paul.
Hey, awesome. Glad to hear it. Thank you so much.
Hey, Paul, I have one final question that I've not ever heard anyone talk to. So when I think about putting systemics in the soil or fungicides, what should I expect about how long those will persist? Are they cation exchange, enabled as well, or what should I expect there?
It will definitely depend on the product. So I've researched specifically imidacloprid, which is your typical systemic insecticide. And my research on that, it will suppress microbial activity, but not eliminate it. And that is kind of what I've seen. I will treat a lot of my tropicals with imidacloprid when I bring them in the fall, just to wipe out anything that was hiding. It's typically about this time of year, February to this time of year, that it wears off and a pest might show up. And it's somewhat anecdotal. It's me pulling my moisture meter out and seeing the fungal hyphae. It's still there, still doing its thing. As far as fungicides and so forth that are actually targeted funguses, probably way more detrimental.
Hey, Paul, one last question. I'm seeing a compost with mycorrhiza in it now in my nursery. Does that actually work?
Depends on the type of mycorrhizae, if they can tell you. And again, that'll probably somewhat be dictated by what the compost is growing on. Typically what I've seen for that is geared or marketed towards vegetable growing, which is actually going to be the endomycorrhizal, or the interior root structure. So that won't be beneficial to your pines and conifers. There may be some tropicals that it's beneficial to though. It's the ectomycorrhizal typically that you want for woody plant material.
Hey, Paul, would you be willing to have the presentation sent out by Pat as an email to the members? Okay.
Absolutely. I'll as soon as we're done, I'll get it to both of you.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep.
All right. Sounds like we've come to the end of the questions, and I don't see any more on here. One final reminder, though. This will be posted. It was recorded and will be posted on the YouTube channel. So make sure to, I think as someone mentioned, make sure to check that out and perhaps share it and like it and continue to spread the word. Well, thanks, Paul. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it. Hope everyone else, and look forward to seeing everybody again.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Paul.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.